That year hit me before the mud did. Most people know 1812 for the war. The burning of Washington. Napoleon's catastrophic Russian campaign. The year the world was already on fire from one end to the other. But there is another story from 1812, one that doesn't appear in the history books, one that wasn't given a name until researchers started connecting threads that had been deliberately kept separate, and it begins not with armies or diplomats but with the ground itself. The ground moved. And then it swallowed something. What it swallowed is still down there, in cities across 3 continents, in layers of uniform gray-brown silt that geologists note with curiosity and archaeologists find inconvenient and municipal engineers quietly build over. A civilization, or the remnants of one, pressed beneath a deposit of mud that arrived fast enough to bury front doors with the mail still in the slot and leave window frames intact at depths that take modern excavators by surprise. The silence above that mud layer is almost as thick as the mud itself. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was tracing the origin of the term mud flood in 19th century engineering literature, looking for its first documented use as a technical descriptor, and instead I found its absence. The term doesn't appear in 19th century engineering literature with any consistency. Events that, by their described characteristics, should carry that label are instead described in passive, administrative language. Significant sediment deposit. Unusual silting event. Rapid grade change of unclear origin. The technical vocabulary for what happened exists in fragments across dozens of unconnected reports. Nobody assembled them into a single phrase because nobody, officially, was looking at them as a single event. That absence, the absence of a name for something that clearly happened, is the most interesting thing I encountered in months of research. Events get named when they're acknowledged. They stay nameless when acknowledgement is inconvenient. The timeline isn't subtle. The official story goes like this. The year 1812 was geologically turbulent in ways that are well documented and academically mainstream. The New Madrid seismic events, a sequence of earthquakes beginning December 16, 1811 and continuing through February 1812, were among the most powerful seismic events in recorded North American history. The Mississippi River ran backward. Entire sections of riverbank collapsed. Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee was formed overnight when land subsidence created a basin that the river immediately filled. The earthquakes were felt from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic seaboard. This is not disputed. It is in every geology textbook that covers North American seismic history. What the geology textbooks do not dwell on is the hydrological aftermath. A series of catastrophic earthquakes along the most extensive river system in North America, occurring in winter when the ground is saturated and the rivers are running high. What happens to the water? What happens to the accumulated sediment in the river channels, the floodplains, the vast low-lying interior of a continent that drains toward the Gulf through a single massive artery? Let me be fair to the official narrative. Geologists do model seismically triggered floods. The phenomenon is called a seiche, a standing wave generated in a body of water by ground movement, and it can produce dramatic, rapid inundation events. The New Madrid earthquakes generated seiches documented as far away as the Great Lakes and the eastern seaboard. Boats were thrown onto riverbanks. Waterfalls appeared temporarily on the Mississippi as the river surface oscillated. But a seiche is temporary. It recedes. What I am describing is something that did not recede, a deposit of material that settled and stayed, that changed the effective ground level of a vast region permanently, that buried whatever stood in the lowlands under a layer of material that is still there 2 centuries later. That is not a seiche. That is something larger. And the official narrative has not named it. Let's start with the numbers, because numbers are where the comfortable explanations begin to fail. The uniform mud deposit associated with the 1811 to 1812 seismic period has been documented, individually, without connection, in geotechnical surveys across at least 19 states and 4 Canadian provinces. I've been assembling these references for months, pulling them from geotechnical boring logs, archaeological site reports, and municipal excavation records. The deposit is described consistently, fine-grained, gray to reddish-brown, mineral-rich, low in organic content, and remarkably uniform in composition across distances of hundreds of miles. Uniform. That word appears again and again in the technical literature, always noted as unusual, never explained. River sediment is not uniform across hundreds of miles. Different tributaries carry different mineral signatures. Different soil types contribute different particle sizes. A natural flood deposit, even a large one, should show variation as you move across the landscape. The deposit associated with the 1812 period does not. It is compositionally consistent from Ohio to Louisiana, from the Atlantic coastal plain to the eastern edge of the Great Plains. That uniformity suggests a single source event. A single episode of massive material mobilization that covered the landscape fast enough that the deposit didn't have time to sort and differentiate by region. Speaking of sources, there is a paper, published in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society, Volume 8, 1843, by a naturalist named Edmund Ravenel, describing soil anomalies he had observed across the Carolina lowlands. Ravenel noted a layer of what he called exotic silt, his term, lying at a consistent depth of 3 to 5 feet across his survey area, beneath the ordinary topsoil but above the geological subsoil. He described it as not consistent with ordinary alluvial deposit and noted its unusual mineral composition. He suggested it represented a catastrophic inundation of continental scale, occurring within the memory of living persons at the time of my survey. Within the memory of living persons. Ravenel was writing in 1843. The living memory he referenced pointed back to the period around 1812. His paper was published, noted in a few subsequent bibliographies, and then effectively disappeared from the literature. It is in the American Philosophical Society's archive in Philadelphia today. It has been cited, as far as I can determine, 3 times in the past 180 years. The timing is almost theatrical. Which brings me to the civilization question. Because the mud deposit is only half the story. The other half is what the mud is sitting on top of. Across the same geographic footprint where the 1812 deposit appears, excavations from the 19th century onward have repeatedly encountered structural remains, walls, floors, foundations, occasionally entire room complexes, at depths consistent with burial by the deposit. Structures sitting just below the mud layer, or embedded within its lower strata, in a physical relationship that suggests they were standing when the material arrived. I have documented, from primary sources, 14 such discoveries made between 1830 and 1950. 14 is almost certainly a fraction of the actual number. Most excavation reports from this period did not describe their findings in terms that would make them searchable by a modern researcher looking for buried structures. You have to read the original documents, the full boring logs, the complete excavation diaries, the unedited survey reports, to find the relevant passages, which are often single sentences in documents that run to dozens of pages. But the 14 I've confirmed share a specific characteristic that I find significant. In each case, the structure encountered is described as being in relatively good condition given its apparent age. Walls standing. Floors intact. Architectural features, doorframes, window openings, decorative elements, preserved. This is the physical signature of rapid burial, not gradual accumulation. Gradual accumulation produces ruins. It gives structures time to deteriorate before the earth consumes them. What we find at the base of the 1812 deposit looks like structures that were buried before they had time to fall apart. That's not the passage of centuries. That's one event, one season, possibly one day. The part that keeps me up at night is a witness account from a place nobody looks. Indigenous oral traditions from the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys contain accounts of a catastrophic event, described variously as a great flood, a time of mud, or a period when the rivers vomited the land, that elders in the early 19th century associated with recent memory rather than ancient mythology. These accounts were collected, inconsistently and incompletely, by missionaries and government agents in the decades following 1812. They are scattered across church archives, Bureau of Indian Affairs records, and the field notebooks of early ethnographers. They are not cited in geological discussions of the New Madrid earthquakes. They are not cited in archaeological discussions of the buried structures. They exist in a separate archival universe, categorized as ethnographic material rather than geological witness testimony, and the two literatures have almost never been read together. When you read them together, they describe the same event from the human perspective that the geotechnical boring logs describe from the subsurface perspective. A rapid, massive, landscape-altering inundation. Mud arriving faster than people could respond. Low-lying settlements consumed. The survivors retreating to high ground and watching the familiar world disappear beneath a surface that, when it finally stilled, was several feet higher than it had been before. I am not saying this proves a civilization was destroyed overnight. I am saying that the physical record and the human record, read together, describe the same event, and that the institutional separation of those two records has prevented the convergent picture from being assembled and examined. Let me address the hardest question directly. If a civilization was buried in 1812, or in the period immediately surrounding it, whose civilization was it? This is where the evidence becomes genuinely uncertain, and I want to be careful about the distinction between what the record shows and what I'm inferring from it. What the record shows, structural remains at depths consistent with 1812-era burial, across a geographic range that encompasses most of the inhabited interior of North America, displaying construction techniques that range from simple to sophisticated. Some of the buried structures are consistent with known indigenous architectural traditions. Some are not. Some show construction methods, dressed stone, engineered drainage, non-local materials, that don't fit cleanly into the pre-contact archaeological record as currently understood. What I'm inferring, that the 1812 period may have been not just geologically catastrophic but civilization-ally catastrophic, that it interrupted, disrupted, or ended a phase of human occupation and construction whose physical remains we keep finding and keep building over without assembling into a coherent picture. Maybe the structures that don't fit the known record represent a pre-contact tradition that archaeology hasn't fully characterized yet. Maybe some of them represent very early European settlement infrastructure that was established and then destroyed before it made it into the historical record. Maybe the uniformity of the deposit and the breadth of the buried structures are coincidental, two unrelated phenomena that I am connecting because I have spent too long looking at them in isolation. Maybe. But the deposit is uniform. The structures are intact. The witnesses, geological and human, describe the same event. And the institutional record declines, consistently and across 2 centuries, to put these pieces together. Speaking of institutional records, there is a document I have been trying to access for 8 months. In 1816, a survey commission was established by an act of Congress to assess land damage and ownership disputes arising from the New Madrid earthquakes. The commission operated for several years, took testimony from hundreds of claimants, and produced a final report that was submitted to Congress in 1820. That report, or a version of it, is in the National Archives under the records of the General Land Office, Record Group 49. What is not in Record Group 49, despite being referenced in the Commission's own correspondence, is the appendix to that report. The appendix, referenced in multiple internal Commission documents as containing testimony regarding landscape alteration and structural loss beyond ordinary earthquake damage, was apparently submitted separately from the main report. The main report is catalogued and accessible. The appendix is listed in the Commission's own index as submitted separately per Chairman's direction, March 14, 1820. It does not appear in any National Archives catalog I have been able to search. I have submitted 3 separate research inquiries to the National Archives regarding this appendix. The responses have been courteous and unhelpful. The appendix is not in Record Group 49. It is not in the adjacent General Land Office records. It is not in the congressional records for the relevant session. It was submitted, per the Commission's own documentation, in March of 1820, and it has not been seen since. 200 years. The testimony of hundreds of witnesses to the most catastrophic geological event in American history, describing landscape alteration and structural loss that the commission chairman considered significant enough to separate from the main report, sitting somewhere in an archive, or not sitting anywhere at all. Buried in plain sight. Or buried somewhere else. I want to return to the mud itself, because the mud is ultimately what makes this story physical rather than speculative. Fine-grained. Gray to reddish-brown. Mineral-rich. Low organic content. Uniform across hundreds of miles. Deposited rapidly enough to preserve the structures beneath it in relatively good condition. Geotechnical engineers encounter this layer constantly. It shows up in boring logs from Mississippi to Massachusetts. It is noted, characterized, and built through, because it is, from a structural engineering standpoint, a moderately good foundation layer once it has consolidated. Engineers don't ask where it came from. They ask whether it can bear the load. And it can. So the buildings go up, and the mud layer goes into the boring log as a geological unit, and the question of its origin remains unasked. But origin matters. Because if this layer was deposited in a single event, or a compressed series of events within a few years of 1812, then it is the physical record of the most significant geological hydrological event to affect the North American continent in the historical period. It is more geographically extensive than any single flood event in the documented record. It is more compositionally uniform than any natural sediment deposit that hasn't been attributed to a specific, identifiable source. And sitting just below it, in site after site across the continent, are the structures that were there when it arrived. Here is what I believe the complete picture looks like, offered not as conclusion but as pattern. Between approximately 1811 and 1815, a combination of seismic events, hydrological cascades, and possibly additional factors not yet characterized in the geological literature produced a massive mobilization of sediment across the interior of North America. This sediment, the uniform gray-brown layer that geotechnical engineers still encounter today, was deposited rapidly across low-lying terrain from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, covering existing ground level by depths ranging from 3 to 14 feet depending on local topography. Whatever stood at ground level in those low-lying regions, indigenous settlements, early European structures, agricultural infrastructure, and possibly architectural traditions that don't fit cleanly into either category, was buried by this deposit. Some structures were abandoned before burial, some were caught mid-use. The survivors of whatever communities existed in these regions adapted, retreated to higher ground, rebuilt at the new grade, and either couldn't or didn't document what had been lost with the specificity the event deserved. In the decades that followed, city after city built on top of the deposit, occasionally encountering the structures beneath it, filing brief anomalous notes in engineering reports, and continuing work. The administrative record normalized the new ground level. The basement classification codes were revised. The grade-raising projects formalized what the mud had begun. And the uniform layer settled into the subsurface of the continent, patient and dense and full of what it covered. It is still there. In every city built on lowland terrain in the eastern half of North America. In the geotechnical boring logs of every major construction project. In the archaeological record of every excavation that goes deep enough. The mud flood of 1812 didn't get a name because naming it would have required explaining it. And explaining it would have required acknowledging what it buried. And acknowledging what it buried would have required a reckoning with a chapter of this continent's history that the 19th century, for reasons that may have been practical as much as conspiratorial, chose to build over rather than excavate. I don't have answers. Only patterns. Only a uniform gray-brown layer, 4 to 14 feet down, pressing on the rooftops of a world that went under fast enough that the doors were still unlocked when the mud arrived. And once you understand what that layer is, you will never look at a basement the same way again.